We have Julie Brandt with Parametrix and Janet Geer with the City of Bothell. Please go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A chat box, and I'll be taking a look at them during the presentation, and I will ask them at the end. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Kayla. We're going to go ahead and get started. So, Janet, nod if you can see the screen here. All right. So, today we're going to be talking about the a basin scoring tool. And hang on a second, I need to make Windows go away so that I can, there we go, now I can see you guys. So today we're talking about the SMAP basin scoring tool that Parametrix developed with the City of Bothell. It is a GIS spreadsheet tool. It was meant to deliberately made simple so that it would be cost effective and open source. And it quantifies and predicts watershed needs. I'm going to go into the mechanics and the content of the tool in this presentation. Today's learning objectives. SMAP is on everybody's mind. Many municipalities are coming at this with different ideas, technology, developing tools. You'll hear about a lot of them today. So today for this presentation, we want you to be able to understand the general use and application of this SMAP basin scoring tool, determine whether or not it might be a good fit for your jurisdiction, be able to kind of see what the other tools do, look at this one and say, okay, you know, what might work? As I said, we've deliberately kept this very open source. So hopefully there's some of it that you might be able to use. And then also review analysis, lessons, and tips that were meaningful for us in this process. So it's Janet and I here talking to you today. And Janet, would you like to say hello to the group?
Certainly. So Janet Geer, Surface Water Division within the City of Bothell. We maintain all the aspects of the NPDES permit in addition to drainage and small capital projects.
Yeah, and I'm Julie Brandt. I'm a senior surface water engineer with Parametrix, and I specialize in watershed planning and municipal stormwater management, regulatory compliance, hydraulic modeling. So this is right up my alley. This is what I do. Quickly, how Parametrix and City of Bothell started working together on this. Obviously, the ecology SMAP requirements came out in 2019, and Bothell was getting ready to update their surface and stormwater master plan this year. One very crafty thing that they did was, in anticipation of the SMAP requirements, everybody has different sized drainage basins. That's how streams work. But Bothell took all of their different basins and subdivided some of them. So in general, all of the analysis units, the different catchments would be roughly the same size. And they based that kind of around the guidance of ecology's SMAP 1 acre or 1 square mile threshold. And so moving forward, then they're using this tool and other information to document the conditions, data gaps, and choose the basin coming up by the SMAP deadline. And one thing that I want to point out is that Bothell is really looking at a regional intent for this work, partnering with neighboring jurisdictions. But for this first push, they deliberately took a local analysis to kind of figure out what their own impact and their own responsibility and possibility for mitigation, what they had control over. So then moving forward, looking at the SMAP and how the basin scoring tool fits into that and other forms of watershed planning, there's all this GIS information that goes into it. In Bothell's case, impervious surface, tree cover, land cover, so forth, things that I'm going to go into detail. The other thing too is that, like any tool, you take the scores, the results of the SMAP, and you put those on the table with other information. You might have other information about the basin that you just didn't want in the scoring. You wanted to look at that, highlight that on its own. For Bothell, that was water quality data. And then even additional information beyond that that's less quantitative, like Are there mitigation project opportunities already going on in one particular basin? Are there maybe political issues? You know, is there funding and finance and things like that? So this way you can integrate this tool into other information that you already have as professionals managing your stormwater program. So now, please do not be alarmed. This is my Jackson Pollock slide, so there's a lot on here. And I'm going to talk about the details. You know, we're going to go into some of these elements in more detail later. But the point being for this slide is that, as I said, this is a GIS and spreadsheet tool. And we use this in different ways. So we have other instances of this where more of the components that are shown kind of on the spreadsheet side of this can be automated in GIS, or you can just do the GIS mapping and keep all these elements on the spreadsheet side. And that flexibility is deliberate depending on your staff needs and time constraints and things like that. For Bothell, their GIS department is serving all of the different departments within the city. So they wanted to take that pressure off of them and just get the GIS data, and then keep the spreadsheet modifications and the additional little tweaks and updates that they wanted to do all in the spreadsheet so that their surface water staff could have control and responsibility for that. So let's go into some of the components. Here are some example inputs. The intent of this is really to use existing GIS data. And then as more information is added to GIS, you can update this analysis and include that. So everyone out here, most people attending this conference are managing a stormwater program. So you have a lot of, you know your municipalities, you know what you have. This helps use that data and organize it and document it in a way that helps you make decisions, and then is also makes things more transparent for your public, your city council, and other stakeholders. So a couple things I want to talk about in a few of the input elements. First of all, critical areas are set aside. You want to map those, you want to know where they are, but we don't do math on those. Critical areas are protected and set aside. So it's assumed they won't be changing because this tool has an existing and future component. Tree cover was a good example for City of Bothell of something that we were able to take. Bothell has a really good tree cover GIS layer. For this analysis, we wanted to give, if you will, like a little bit more credit to areas that could almost be, you know, that act like forest. So what we did is regroup trees and anything that was a contiguous stand of trees. And I believe and we could even factor in height. We did a little bit of that over 1 acre. That was separately classified as forest as opposed to the tree cover. And I'll go into some details later about how that impacted and informed the scoring. So the other two, you know, I have 2 elements down here. As I said, you can take a lot or a little of your GIS data and include it in this analysis. But the 2 components that are really important that you really want to include, and if you have some data gaps there, there's ways that you can fill those in. We'll talk about that. But it's your stormwater management coverage. Where do you have facilities? Where is it not just straight untreated runoff going into your receiving waters? That defines your existing system. And then developable lands. What is already going to be new development or redevelopment in the future, and is going, you know, it's assumed that those are brought up to code. Those help you, and I'll talk about that more. Those help you forecast a future condition. So as I said, your stormwater management current coverage dictates your current conditions in this tool's comparison. What runoff is currently mitigated and to what standard? Is it, you know, what we're kind of calling vintage controls or current standards? You can populate this layer based on, you know, some municipalities have known facilities in their drainage areas. Some have a partial data set of that information, as did Bothell. And then you fill that in, and you can have a hierarchy of the quality of information and fill in the gaps with more estimates. Bothell also had a neat layer that we used quite a bit in this, was the city inspection boundaries. There's basin, they have many of their stormwater facilities mapped, and an inspection, like a parcel boundary that goes with that. So it was assumed that that entire inspection area was treated by a particular facility. Janet and I were talking about how there is a conundrum a lot of times with public versus private mapping. Some municipalities have a lot of information about the private facilities because they require more oversight from the city. You want to make sure those folks are getting their job done, and you kind of know your own facilities off the back of your hand. Sometimes it's the reverse, where the private facilities, you haven't had the ability to collect all that information, but you have a lot of mapped out versions of your own public facilities. Either way, that information is valuable, even if it's partial, and can be included in this analysis. And the reason is, finally, the last method that we use to fill in where there are data gaps, and we're using this with several municipalities right now, is your plat permit date cutoffs. So you've got an area, it was permitted at a certain time. You know when your city adopted different state standards over the years. And when they adopt, ecology had, back in the day, the water quality requirements bumped up a little bit. And then a few years later, the flow control requirements went to our current duration standards. So you can take those dates, you can look at when your jurisdiction adopted them, how much lag time there might have been between permits that were vested before, and you can pick a couple dates. You can see in the small script here where the water quality cutoffs, any development was considered that had a date on it was considered at least kind of vintage water quality, and 1997 was the cutoff for current standards. And then these are the two dates for flow control for vintage, which is more just peak control, and the current standards with duration control. So that's how you come up with your current conditions. The next important element I mentioned is your developable lands layer. So you use this for future forecasting by assuming that new development or redevelopment in your jurisdiction is going to bring that particular area up to current codes. So the point being, with your limited staff resources, as you're deciding how to spend city money, maybe you don't target those areas if you know they're going to be developed, because they're going to be brought up to code. And it's a lot of information to try to organize. Under the Growth Management Act, most municipalities are required to kind of get an updated layer together this summer. We're working with a few municipalities, pulling together information. Bothell used both city information that they had and coordinated with both of the counties that they straddle to get a complete developable lands layer. And as I said, we're working with some other municipalities to help with even estimates of this information through aerial photography review of, where do you have what might be a vacant land, but there's already some development on it. Maybe that's an underdeveloped, not a vacant parcel. And that's how you forecast, what might change in the future. If you have hands off, you're just using the development codes that you already have on the books, how might things be brought up to code? And one thing I want to note here, if you look, where you can then see gaps by looking at these two layers, if you look at where it says 234th Street on here, and then kind of over to the right where it says 39th Avenue, and then I'm going to pop back up to the other slide. So if you look back and forth to these two areas, you kind of see some white space there. And remember that these red hatched lines document what is already mitigated runoff. There's some sort of stormwater control there. And then the shaded orange and pink areas document what would be brought up to code under current, once it gets developed. And so what you see then are all of these blank white areas where they're built out. They're not going to get any better on their own. So that's where you might want to target deliberate, active, proactive retrofitting. So moving on, now you've got all this information about what your land cover is, what the land cover is, which has stormwater management on it, and how that stormwater management might change in the future. So now we assign values, and I want to point out that these values are meant to be comparative between different scenarios that you're looking at for your future build out. So, but they're not made up. They're also based on industry knowledge and practices, on state guidance, but there is professional judgment that goes into here as well. I want to show you a few examples. So here we assign different values for the flow control forecast and the water quality forecast. And as you can see, if you look at the tree layer here, I mentioned how we set aside some stuff and we said this is forest, but then everything else is kind of tree. And you see in flow control, the trees, those less dense trees get a slightly lower score for those land use areas than the forest. But over in water quality, trees are great. So this particular scale is out of 100. If you need different levels of detail, you can make your range more or less. We chose 100 for the city of Bothell. And then as you can see, forest and trees, it doesn't matter whether they're no control or the vintage or current, they all kind of do the same thing. But then if you look at another example like hard surfaces, you can see for flow control, non-pollution generating impervious, parking, roads, hard surfaces have runoff. They have the same runoff. We put them way down at the low end. They're not helping lift these scores. But as far as water quality, not all hard surfaces are created equal. So you can see how parking and roads are farther down the scale. But once you get to non-pollution generating, that's almost up in the midsection there. So a little example of how the values get assigned. And you can modify these based on what you know about your jurisdiction. So here's the example output that you get. And one thing I haven't talked about yet is how you weight the different scores, because you might have something that, oh my gosh, that score looks terrible, but it's only really 1% of the overall contribution. So while you're not going to ignore it, it might not be first on your list. For Bothell, different ways that different municipalities that were using this tool have weighted these. Some will do it strictly based on the size of the different basins. As I mentioned, Bothell took that out of the equation by equalizing the size of their analysis areas. What Bothell chose, what we worked into this, was the amount of the basin that is within the city, so that Bothell was giving a higher score to a basin that they had more direct control over. So that's where you see these higher numbers. And so then you have the existing score, that's the raw runoff based on the land use, and then where there was current stormwater management that factored it in. And those are composite scores for each one of those analysis areas. Then the expected score that you see in the middle of each of these for the flow control and the water quality, that's that forecasted score that I was telling you about. For this one in particular, you look at different scenarios. You see in the upper left-hand corner, it says, oh, the improvement scenario here is building out the parcels. So this is the one where the city just hands off, sees what happens when everything builds out. And you can see in some areas where development would lift that score, you know, once those areas are worked on. And that way the city can then focus on other areas that aren't going to get better on their own. And tentatively right now, so as I said, both because of scores, and then Bothell also looked at all those other elements like some of their water quality data, which they wanted to highlight separately, and project opportunities and momentum that they already had in certain basins. They have tentatively selected the 3 basins with the little stars on them as the priority basins, and will likely be moving forward with Lower North Creek. But as
Julie,
you can, yes,
this is your less than 10-minute warning.
Thank you. So I'm going to wrap up here soon. So I want to show you a quick scenario. One thing that one of the applications of this tool is to kind of see, okay, so what would different development scenarios give you? One thing we looked at was, okay, what if you went back and retrofit all the roads? And then separately, well, what if we took all the forest areas and protected them, took them out of development opportunity? And we're like, well, roads are bad. But if you look at this, what we found for the particular basin that's highlighted, circled here, retrofitting the roads didn't give as much of a lift as the forest protection in that basin, because there were more forests to be protected. So that gave the city decision makers some good information. It was a little aha moment for them. And that's so that's basically how the tool works, and the different scenarios, how you can use it to kind of look at different possibilities in your long range planning. And then Bothell's moving forward. Janet, do you want to talk briefly about some of the next steps?
Certainly. So we are going to review the capacity of our existing system. So basically, are there facilities where they are not at full capacity that we could utilize that? Are there areas where we've got overcapacity that we could put in regional systems, that type of thing? We're going to look for our opportunities to offset existing development. We're going to review for regional project opportunities, like I mentioned, not just with the capacity, but where are those open space lands? Where do we want to preserve and protect? Where do we have existing capital projects that we can, maybe build onto? And then with the public and private partnerships, we have with that Vision 2050 that she had mentioned with community development, we have a couple of areas that are going to be subject to really dense development. And there's opportunities there for us to partner with folks to make some, good improvements in the area that otherwise wouldn't take place.
Thanks, Janet. All right. And so finally, the lessons and tips. I'll go through this quickly because these were things I already stressed in the presentation. Consider your analysis units. It really made a difference the way Bothell had already got a jump on this and subdelineated some of their basins to have more equal analysis units. These next 2 go together. Estimate your current stormwater management and forecast your developable lands, because that's where you can, you're not only looking at your existing condition, but you're incorporating that into your long range planning and making your stormwater management decisions, that way all these decisions are in support of each other rather than in conflict with your long range planning. Balance the scores with the other factors like the water quality data, project opportunities. We have another municipality that's using, they're looking at their riparian corridors and seeing what's intact and what isn't. So in the end, watershed planning requires assumptions. So make sure that yours are relevant and informed, and this Basin Scoring Tool is one thing to help you do that. So thank you very much. That's the end of the presentation, and we're ready and eager to answer any questions that you might have.
Yes, thank you both. That was a great presentation. We have just under 5 minutes left for any questions. Please type them in the chat box.
And Kayla, am I correct that if there's more questions later, please do email Janet and I. We're happy to follow up if you think of something later.
Yes, definitely. And the contact information should be in the program.
I know when I'm at these, I know when I'm participating in these conferences, I can't always think of my questions right away.
If we have a moment, I would just mention a couple of lessons learned from the city side. Creating a draft. We really thought we would get done with this a lot more smoothly and a lot more quickly. And it was really great to have that additional time for us to say, take a step back, review our draft, and then do some further analysis, which we hadn't anticipated in the beginning.
All right, we've got one question here. Could you describe a little more about the existing and expected scores?
Yeah, and let's see if I can multitask here and find that slide for you while I'm talking about it. So when you're coming up with your existing and expected scores, one of the things that we talked about is, you get this splash of expected scores based on whatever forecast scenario you're looking at. And then you say, okay, so what does that mean? Where do we go? And as a city, you want to decide, well, what do we, it's a process rather than kind of an endpoint. So you look at different milestones. So Janet, I can't remember exactly where we landed with Bothell, but I know that we all selected a particular kind of composite goal for this first push. And I think it that to make sure that each basin was at least as high as the city's composite score.
That's correct. We were focusing on what would come up to that composite score on its own, and then what would need help from us to reach that composite score.
Yeah. And that's what, and that's the goal for this moment in time. So then as you're able to lift those scores through different, as development happens, as you have in areas where the city can do proactive retrofitting and install more stormwater controls, you then map that into the GIS, add it to the existing score, and you see how those existing scores lift and so on. And then how the future scores would change.
I'm going to stop you right there if that's okay. We have just 1 minute left to close the meeting. Okay. We've got a few more questions, and if you would be willing, we can direct those questions to you and then post them later. If that sounds okay. Great. So everyone gets their questions answered.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. That was really great.
Okay.
And
yeah, absolutely.
Like I mentioned earlier, if you have any other questions, you can look in the program for email or phone contact info for both Janet and Julie.
And I've gotten Janet's go ahead on this, that the city deliberately wants to share this information and help others use it. So I will please direct questions to both of us, but if you get just to one of us, we'll share it with the other and get back to you.
Thank you so much.